you're listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspiration for growing your self-publishing business. I'm your host, Stephanie McGrath, and the Publisher Operations Specialist here at Kobo Writing Life.
And I'm Laura Granger, the Author Engagement Specialist on the business team.
So this episode is a special recording of a fireside chat we had with New York Times bestselling author Holly Black here in the offices in Toronto. She talked to us about how she got her start in the industry. Her first book was actually published in 2002, and she talked to us about the YA genre and how it's changed since she first started out.
We talked to her about her latest release, The Queen of Nothing, in the Folk and Air trilogy, and what she's working on next.
So please keep listening.
When she saw the man, she went pale. "Go to your room," she told Jude in a scary voice. "Now." "Whose child is that?" the man asked, pointing at her. His voice was oddly accented. "Yours. His." "No one's." Mom didn't even look in Jude's direction. "She's no one's child." That wasn't right. Jude and Taryn looked just like their dad. Everyone said so. She took a few steps toward the stairs, but didn't want to be alone in her room. Vivi, Jude thought. Vivi will know who the tall man is. Vivi will know what to do. But Jude couldn't seem to make herself move any farther. "I've seen many impossible things," the man said. "I've seen the acorn before the oak. I've seen the spark before the flame. But never have I seen such as this. A dead woman living. A child born from nothing." Mom seemed at a loss for words. Her body was vibrating with tension. Jude wanted to take her hand and squeeze it, but she didn't dare. "I doubted Bailkin when he told me I'd find you here," said the man, his voice softening. "The bones of an earthly woman and her unborn child in the burned remains of my estate were convincing. Do you know what it is to return from battle, to find your wife dead, your only heir with her? To find your life reduced to ash?" Mom shook her head, not as if she was answering him, but as though she was trying to shake off the words. He took a step toward her, and she took a step back. There was something wrong with the tall man's leg. He moved stiffly, as though it hurt him. The light was different in the entry hall, and Jude could see the odd green tint of his skin and the way his lower teeth seemed too large for his mouth. She was able to see that his eyes were like Vivi's. "I was never going to be happy with you," Mom told him. "Your world isn't for people like me." The tall man regarded her for a long moment. "You made vows," he said finally. She lifted her chin. "And then I renounced them." His gaze went to Jude, and his expression hardened. "What is a promise from a mortal wife worth? I suppose I have my answer." Mom turned. At her mother's look, Jude dashed into the living room. Taryn was still sleeping. The television was still on. Vivienne looked up with half-lidded cat eyes. "Who's at the door?" she asked. "I heard arguing." "A scary man," Jude told her, out of breath even though she'd barely run at all. Her heart was pounding. "We're supposed to go upstairs." She didn't care that Mom had told only her to go upstairs. She wasn't going by herself. With a sigh, Vivi unfolded from the couch and shook Taryn awake. Drowsily, Jude's twin followed them into the hallway. As they started toward the carpet-covered steps, Jude saw her father come in from the back garden. He held an axe in his hand, forged to be a near replica of one he'd studied in a museum in Iceland. It wasn't weird to see Dad with an axe. He and his friends were into old weapons and would spend lots of time talking about material culture and sketching ideas for fantastical blades. What was odd was the way he held the weapon, as if he was going to. Her father swung the axe toward the tall man. He had never raised a hand to discipline Jude or her sisters, even when they got into big trouble. He wouldn't hurt anyone. He just wouldn't.
So thank you for joining us
Thanks for having me.
and battling the snow to get here.
A little bit. It seems gone now, though.
Yeah, it's like it never happened, basically. At least to me. So we have many fans in the office today. So for anyone who doesn't know, Holly Black is a #1 New York Times bestselling author with over 30 fantasy novels for kids and teens. Many of the teens are now adults here, I think. And you've been publishing for almost 19 years, which I did the math, so it could be wrong. But your first book...
No, you're right.
Your first book was published in 2002, so I just want to hear more about how you got your start in the publishing industry.
So, it was a while ago, and things were a little different. So, I had been working on my first book, which was Tithe, for about 5 years, and I thought of it as an adult book, and I had a friend who was a teen librarian, and she said, I think this might be a YA book. And I was like, really? I don't know about that. Maybe. What is that? What is that like? And she gave me Garth Nix and Tammy Pierce books to take home, and I read them, and I thought, well, I don't know if it's a YA book, but I want in on this because these books are fabulous, and this is, a really exciting place to be publishing. And at the same time, I was friends with Tony DeLizzi, who I would go on to do Spiderwick with. We were friends because I had interviewed him for Gaming Magazine because he used to do artwork for Dungeons & Dragons and Changeling the Dreaming games. And so I had been working on this gaming magazine, and he was publishing picture books. And I knew his editor a little bit, and his editor said he would take a look at my book and tell me if it was a YA book or not. And he wound up acquiring it. And I will tell you how long ago it was, which was that I had bought manuscript boxes, to send it out in, because I would have been mailing it out, physically mailing it, if he hadn't wound up acquiring it. And it was also during a time when you could talk to editors more directly in kids publishing, that, there were a lot of people who were unagented, and who would go directly to editors.
Do you think you'll be publishing for 19 years?
To me, being published once was such a huge dream that it seemed impossible. And in fact, after I sold Tithe, I was happy, super, super happy for months. Someone rear-ended my car, and I was like, no problem, that's all great. And then I think I messed up my brain chemicals, because then I went into a weird depression that summer where I became sure that I was about to die, and looked up pseudo-academic articles on the afterlife because I needed to know what was going to happen since my death was imminent. And many years later, I figured out that this was probably because I had one goal in life, and that was to sell a book. And so my brain was like, well done then, I guess it's only death for you. And so, yeah, I really didn't think beyond one book. Yeah. That was sort of the goal, and everything after was, an uncharted area for me. But I do think that that I personally define success in publishing as staying on the bicycle. If you can keep publishing, then you're still on top. You still got you're still in the game.
So how have you seen YA evolve over the years since you started?
So my first book came out, that's Tithe, in 2002, and Spiderwick came out in 2003. And that winter, I went to an SCBWI, which is a Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators conference. And I didn't know very many people, and I was standing in line in the bathroom, and I guess people had been told to network wherever, including in the bathrooms. And so a woman turned to me and she said, what do you write? And I said, oh, YA, my first book just came out. And she turned around to talk to somebody else. Because YA was a category of publishing that most people were just not interested in. It was a very small category of publishing. People were much more interested in middle grade and picture books. And so in the time that I have been publishing, YA just got bigger and bigger and bigger. and, moved outside in many stores, the children's section, and is, has much more crossover to adults' purchasability.
So how have you been able to, basically what's your writing process like? Do you have a writing process? Does it change for each book that you have?
I mean, it has changed a lot over the years. I started out with a terrible writing process that has only gotten marginally better, but I will tell you about it. Do not do what I do. It's really the lesson here. But, and I would basically write the first chapter. I would sort of plan ahead. Then I would write the second chapter. Then I would realize all the things that were wrong with the first chapter, and I would go back and edit it. And then I would edit the second chapter, and then I would write the third chapter, and then I would go back to the first chapter and edit it. Then I would go back to the second chapter. This was a miserable process, but I continued with it because it was the only way that I could figure out how to move through a book. And so my journey over the years has been to be better at figuring things out ahead of time and be better at actually writing forward even when I know that there's things that I'm leaving broken behind me.
Mm-hmm. What's your editing process like?
I love editing.
Yeah.
I really dislike drafting. To me, drafting is you have this great idea, it lives up here, and you are translating it down and turning it into crap. And editing is like cleaning the bathroom. You're not going to make it any worse, so you so the pressure's off. And I like to take the whole book, print it out, mark it up. I have critique partners. I have a critique group. We'll have a meeting. They will tell me many things that are wrong and things that they would like to see me do, and we will discuss things that I, potential fixes. And we'll mark down in each chapter things that I want to do, just sort of big picture stuff, and put in sticky notes and highlighting, and then I'll also line edit it. Mm-hmm. And then I'll set a schedule for myself and do some number of chapters per day.
So do you have any plans to write kind of like a middle grade audience again? Because I know you did the Spiderwick Chronicles before. Have you thought about going back to that age group?
Well, I just finished, actually, not that long ago, the Magisterium series that I co-wrote with Cassandra Clare. Mm-hmm. So, yes, I would love to do more middle grade stuff. I love doing Spiderwick. I love doing Doll Bones. But right now, I don't currently have a book that I'm working on, but I would, would love to do more.
And speaking of Cassandra Clare, you've collaborated a few times now with different authors. Do you have any tips for authors who are considering, like, collaborative writing? Have you found it different from project to project?
Wait, actually, I just had a middle grade come out. Heart of the Moors.
Oh,
It just came out. I did do a middle grade. I did a Maleficent middle grade that came out like 2 months ago.
Oh, perfect.
I'm on it. On top of it. Not mentally on top of it. Sorry. What was that last question?
So I was saying, speaking of Cassandra Clare, so you've done a few different collaborative projects. Have you found it different project to project? The process,
Yeah.
Do you have any suggestions for authors who are considering that collaborative type of writing?
So I have only ever really collaborated with friends. And I think that's helpful because I think you already have a friend shorthand of how to move through disagreements and how to work on things together. But working with Tony on Spiderwick was very different than working with Cassie. With Tony, we would get together and we would talk about what was going to happen in Spiderwick, and then I would go off and write and he would go off and draw, and we would send stuff back and forth and sort of give each other comments. But with Cassie, we were actually writing over each other. I would write like 400 words and I would hand them to her, and we only ever worked on Magisterium when we were together in the same physical space. So we would pass laptops back and forth.
Oh, wow.
And so I would write, 400 words and she would write over them, and then write 400 words and I would write over them, in part because we wanted to have Cal have one voice. It's from his point of view, and often when people collaborate, they sort of take different characters, but because we wanted to have that one voice, it had to be consistent, which meant a voice that was not quite either of our voices. So I think that was something that maybe not everybody would like to do, but I found it really fun. And I think the two things that I would say when you're collaborating are, I think it's really helpful to, because you're sharing this thing, have something that's just yours. I think having my own projects that I controlled everything in and got to make all the decisions allowed me to be really flexible with the projects that I didn't. And I think, too, a lot of times we think about the difficulty of collaborating as the moments when you don't agree. But in a lot of ways, those are the point of collaboration, because you can sort of put aside both your ideas and figure out some third way through that incorporates what it is you both love about your individual ideas. And finding that third way is the thing you get from collaboration that you will never get from solo writing, right? It's that the thing you will never find on your own. And that's the most fun thing about collaboration.
Every time we talk to authors and asking about their collaboration process, every single one has been different, so it's been fun here.
It's really interesting how it changes from person to person.
So we just want to switch gears a little bit and talk about The Quill Prince. So when I first read it, I'm pretty sure I made everyone that I talked to read it.
I was going to say, I feel like everyone in the office has read it, yeah.
And I've talked about it on the podcast before, being like, you guys should read that. So basically I was wondering, what was your inspiration behind it, and have you always kind of been drawn to fantasy stories?
I've always been drawn to fantasy stories. I don't think that I even know how to write a story that isn't in some form fantastical. I think the thing that I really started with the Folk of the Air series was that the prologue to the first book, which is, Jude and her sisters living in the human world and having their parents killed by Madoc, this redcap, which is a type of fairy that is violent and dips its hat in the blood of the slain, and who has come for his daughter, which is Jude's sister, Vivi, and takes all three girls back to Fairy and raises them as though they were, his children, and how weird that is a space to grow up in, where, there's this person who's kind of your dad and also, the murder of your parents, and you have to live with that dichotomy.
Did anything surprise you when you were writing it? Or was something like a character did something like, you know what, I didn't think that was what was going to happen here?
There were definitely things that I didn't think would happen the way that they did, but they didn't just happen that way. What happened is that I wrote it the way I thought about it and then realized that wasn't the right way to do it. And so it wasn't a surprise like, oh, look, I fixed it for myself. It was the surprise of realizing the way that I thought this was going to go, it cannot go because it doesn't work that way, or it doesn't work as well as it could work, and I need to find a new way that's more interesting. And, oh, wow, I didn't think that's where, I would have to take this, but that is where I had to take it, especially in the third book. There were a lot of things that I planned in the first two books, but with the third book, there were things that I thought I knew what I was going to do with, and then as I was writing it, had that sense of like, okay, this is not the right way. I need to find a new way. Mm-hmm. But I feel like I never get to have the experience of being surprised.
Yeah.
I only get to have the experience of being wrong.
I get the sense, this may not be right, but kind of Jude and Carden sometimes don't do the most likable things, but people still love them anyways. What do you think draws people to Jude and Carden?
Well, I mean, I don't know that likability is such a fraught term, right? Because, we relate to people who are not always likable.
Yeah.
And personally, what I love from I love characters who make mistakes. I like characters who make big mistakes and, do big things. I feel like I spend a lot of time in my own life trying to be likable. And, I think that there is a real pleasure in watching people go for it and watching people, do the things that maybe we don't let ourselves do.
Mm-hmm. It's fun to read about.
So part of what I loved about the Folk and Air series was the world building. So as soon as I finished Queen of Nothing, I immediately missed that world. Do you have plans to kind of go back to Jude's world anytime soon?
I would like to write some more fairy books. I've written, some fairy books in my time, and we'll write some more. I don't have extremely specific plans, but there's some characters in that series that I would like to see again, that I would like to do some things with. So
there was a little bit of a hint of that in Queen of Nothing, I think.
there's some stuff.
So we ask this for everyone who comes on the podcast, but what have you been loving lately? It can be a book, a movie, TV show, podcast, anything that you think other people should check out.
I just finished 2 nights ago a book, Gideon the Ninth, which is great. It was fabulous. Lesbian necromancers in space investigate a haunted house.
I think that's our book club choice.
Really good.
And I think we'll open it up. What's the time?
So time for audience
Yeah,
questions.
you guys have
Does
any
anyone
questions?
have a question for Holly?
We know this is.
Well, the question I had was, I'm always very impressed with stories that can get very political and have multiple plot lines and like hidden agendas. And it's really interesting to hear you say that, at least maybe beforehand, that you used to write chapter by chapter and then go back and edit it. So I don't know if that process has changed at all, but how do you come up with such intricate political situations and like keep everyone in check and have like all these characters planned out?
Well, I think a lot of the political complications come out of a lot of different people having a lot of different specific agendas. And so keeping in mind what the characters want and what they all individually want is a big part of it. I do think that as I have moved forward, I have come to plan out more of the whole of what's going to happen in the story. But I think that also a lot of plot is written in layers. And so there's a lot of it where you sort of know, where when I'm writing it, I know the basic story and I know pieces of the basic story. Like here's where these moments are going to be. And then, what I'm doing is writing the second layer then. And especially when you make the maze. If you think of, plot as a maze, right? In the second draft, you are then running the characters through it, and I think in a way, part of the complication is letting the characters fight the plot in a way that I don't feel like I always can do when I'm first creating it. Like when I'm first creating it, a lot of times I'm like, what could happen in this book? What might occur? And then, once I have sort of that basic shape, the question of like, well, how, if this really happened, each of these characters would fight back against it. And they would try and do this. And if they did that, then how would this other character respond? And how would this character respond? And so, like, thinking of it as building up in layers rather than being something that you know every piece of when you start, I think is sometimes very liberating. I admire people who are able to know that from the get-go and they have every piece figured out. But I don't know very many people like that. I think most people wind up complicating their books as they go, or often in several stages of revision.
You're just at the tail end now of your tour for Queen of Nothing, and so I imagine you've met a lot of people along the way, and you've probably done that several times for other books. What's it like building that relationship, that one-on-one with readers? Like, you meet people, what's that experience like for you to see people reacting to your books and your stories? Do you find that ends up in the future shaping how you write or how you, I don't know, does that affect you like in any way in your career? That's what I'm trying to ask.
So I think it's very moving to meet people who have read your work, because it's like you put this message in a bottle and you send it out into the world, and then you meet the people who received it, and they know your imaginary friends. Which is, you're like, oh, you're friends with my friend. Oh, great. I guess we're friends. But also the experience of being on tour is the experience of signing someone's book, saying a few words to them, and having them drive away. And so you don't get to have a lot of times long conversations. Yeah. You meet people and you hear sort of brief things from them, and you hear longer things from social media, and so you don't always know what people think. Like, I remember when I was getting ready to go out on this tour, and I was like, this will be so exciting. I will, been working on this now for many years, and people have said, well, how does, people have been asking me how it ends, and now we'll be able to talk about how it ends. And my publicist was like, no, you won't. That's spoilers. Like, you can't ever talk about that. But I thought it's true. And so sometimes, as I'm signing, people come up to me, like, I'm done. I'm like, did you like it? And, then they tell me briefly what they think, but, I actually don't have as much information moving away as you might think, because, we're often having the beginning of a conversation.
Yeah.
But there are things about that are good too, because one of the things that I think you have to do when you're writing is you do have to push all of that away, because you have to write the story that you think is the story you most want to tell and the story that resonates with you. And I think it is, there may be people for whom having a lot of voices is helpful and energizing, but for me, I just have to think, nobody's going to read this. This is just for me. Let me make this thing. Let me make this weird thing. And then later I'll figure out whether I think people will like it.
From an author perspective, is there any tactics that you use to shut those voices out when you're in the writing process?
I mean, I think, taking breaks from social media. I was saying that, I was talking about this actually last night about how I, at some point, put a game on my phone to prevent me from going on Twitter. Yeah. So instead, I am playing a game called Lily's Garden, and I'm fixing her a nice garden, unlocking her story. And so I think there are things like that where you just, ways you can sort of step away from the world and then return to it. Not Googling yourself.
Do you read reviews?
Yeah, that was my question.
I read trade reviews, but I don't, and I go and sort of look at, I'll look on Goodreads whether generally like what the general star rating is, because I would want to know if something went horribly awry.
Yeah.
I want to know, do people like it? And that gives me a general sense of thumbs up, thumbs down. But I don't read a bunch of reviews. And I stopped actually, because I did. There was a time I read a bunch of them, and I stopped when I had read a really nice review. And I couldn't write for the rest of the day, because when I started writing, I kept thinking, oh, they won't like it as much. And I thought, if it's not just bad reviews, if it's every review, then I just can't do this anymore.
Since you've written so much for children and for YA, and you thought your first book was going to be adult, do you have any interest in writing something adult? So a lot of times your books can seem very adult, and they deal with a lot of adult themes, so would it seem like a natural transition to write something?
I'm working on an adult book now. I'm still trying to figure it out. It has a different magic system, and I'm trying to figure out what that is, and trying to figure out the story. And so far, I think I've deleted more words than I've actually written, which you would think is not possible, but sort of an existential place of deletion. But that is what I'm working on.
You mentioned that you only collaborate with your friends, but is there anyone that you wish you were friends with? Good. Are you doing bucket list collaborators?
I mean, I don't know. I feel like I don't know that it would be. I think it would be hard to collaborate with someone who you didn't know, because I think I would be very polite. I'd be like, oh, all right. Well, if that's what you like, whereas with your friends, you're like, eh. But I will say a friend of mine that I think would be fun to collaborate with is Lee Bardugo.
Yes.
She's a
political systems, because you guys break things so later.
Yeah, but Lee, she makes an outline and then she sticks to her outline. Seems like it will be hard for me.
So just going back to the different age groups that you've written for, or you're writing for, I know there are a lot of themes that sort of cross over different age categories. My question is for you, what do you think is the big differentiator between middle grade and young adult and adult?
So I think that when you're writing middle grade books, I think you're thinking a lot about family. And you're moving into friendship, but a lot of times the biggest emotional dramas of middle grade are family dramas, and with friendship sort of outside it, and it's finding your sort of place inside those communities. And I think that when you're working in YA space, it's a lot about friendships, relationships, and also becoming an individual, becoming separate from all groups and sort of defining yourself personally and like choosing a future for yourself, you're making a lot of big decisions about who you want to be, often for the first time. And I think when I think about adult, one of the things that interests me about it is that, for one thing, that you have a longer backstory, that you have more space to have a lot of story behind you and a lot of different people that you maybe already were, but also that, my most visceral memory of being a teenager was a desire for something to happen and something to change. And to have that opportunity, I think, to be myself or become myself. And that is like an embrace of chaos that I feel like as an adult, chaos is often the enemy, right? Chaos is losing your job, or, the breakup of a marriage, or, chaos is not as friendly. And it's not that we don't, as adults, choose chaos sometimes, or it's not that we don't reinvent ourselves. But I think we have a much more complicated and uncomfortable relationship with change. And I think that that's a really interesting place to write from.
When you write like a series of books and they are so like politically complex, have you ever experienced, a moment where you've moved on to the next book and you're writing, you're like, oh, why did I make that choice? If I had done this, then I could do this. Or do you find like it's very consistent? Do you have any regrets as well?
I often regret killing people that I think I would find useful later. I'm like, oh man. So yes. But I think that, one of the things that is difficult when you're starting a book is that you have unlimited choices. And so limiting your own choices often actually is helpful. Yes, you're creating a puzzle for yourself, but it's a little bit easier to solve a puzzle than it is to first make a puzzle and then solve a puzzle, which is what you're doing in the first books. And it's true, you can change the puzzle to make it easier to solve, but it's still a more complicated process than just solving the puzzle that you left yourself.
Because you've written a lot in the world of fairy, do you feel sort of pressure to like not break the rules or stick to the myths, or like, I don't want to upset, I don't know, hardcore fairy fans. But do you ever get overwhelmed because there's so much mythology? Do you ever feel intimidated by that?
Well, I think as I was coming into doing the Folk of the Air, I felt a little bit intimidated, because not because I was afraid that I was going to break the rules, but because I didn't feel like I had enough rules, because there isn't a lot of folklore that is set inside of fairy. And I was going to have to, first of all, make some decisions about things that I had managed to, kick the can down the road on for a long time. And I was also just going to have to make up a lot of stuff. And that felt very different and a little bit more like writing high fantasy than, writing sort of contemporary urban fantasy in the way that I was before. It was intimidating, and, like trying to come up with things that feel folkloric, like the Lake of Masks, which is, in the series, a lake, and if you look into it, you see someone looking back at you. You don't see your own reflection. You see the reflection of somebody else who looked into the lake at a totally different time. And I was really proud of coming up with that, because it, to me, felt folkloric in the sense that it was like weird and also kind of useless, but maybe also creepy. And like I was like, oh, this seems fairy like, but I think the texture of fairy has to be right? You want fairies to be eating an oat cake, not a cheesecake. Like, and if it sounds wrong, if it feels wrong, and if it feels wrong, the reader is not going to trust you.
Question about character foils, I guess. One of the characters I found really interesting in the series was Jude's sister. Because she is, I don't want to use a nice word for it, she's interesting, because she has like very strange motivations sometimes. Was she always going to be part of the series, or was she someone that you kind of came up with as a sort of, maybe not an opponent, but kind of an opponent to Jude later?
She was always going to be in the series, and I liked her. I liked Taryn. She's a person who made different choices than Jude did right at the start, and different choices about how she was going to fit into fairy. But like Jude, she really did want to and does want to fit into fairy and find her place there. And I think a lot of times Taryn did not know what was going on with Jude. And so some of her decisions, I think from her side, are less directly in opposition to Jude and more like, I'm playing my own game here. And, I didn't necessarily know it would interfere with your game. And I think in some cases she's sort of resentful because Jude didn't tell her things or left her out of things. But to me, what was interesting about them is that here are two people who believe themselves to be very, very different from one another. And, as it turns out, they may not be as different as they thought.
I think we have just hit time for people to come sign their books, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So we hope you enjoyed our interview with Holly as much as we did, and I'm sure you guys remember me talking about the Cruel Prince on the podcast many times before, and it's very exciting because the publisher has graciously created a promo code for North American KWL podcast listeners to receive 30% off the first book in Holly's The Folk of the Air series. You can receive 30% off The Cruel Prince with promo code KWL Holly. That's KWLHOLLY.
This offer will expire January 18th, 2020, so make sure to go to Kobo.com, search for The Cruel Prince by Holly Black, and use promo code KWL Holly at checkout to save 30% off your purchase today. Once again, that is KWL Holly.
And if you're feeling lazy, like many people sometimes are, we will have a direct link to her book in our description for you to check out. Thank you for listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast. If you're interested in purchasing any of Holly's titles, ebook, or audiobooks, we will have links to her titles in our description. And if you're interested in growing your sales, visit KoboWritingLife.com. And if you like listening to our podcast, please make sure to rate, review, and subscribe at all our podcast retailers. It helps other listeners find our podcast.
This episode was produced by Stephanie McGrath and Laura Granger and edited by Kelly Robothon. Music is provided by Tearjerker, and special thanks to Holly Black and the team at Hachette for joining us today.
If you're ready to start your self-publishing journey today, sign up for free at kobo.com/writinglife. Until next time, happy writing.